On the evening of Sunday, the 9th of August 2026, an Irish Air Corps jet came down onto the runway at Casement Aerodrome in Baldonnel, on the western edge of Dublin. On board was a 49-year-old man who had not set foot in Ireland in more than 10 years. At 6:49 in the evening, a detective sergeant from the Garda National Drugs and Organised Crime Bureau arrested Daniel Kinahan on the tarmac. He was driven into the city under armed escort. Members of the Emergency Response Unit and the Armed Support Unit traveled with the convoy. A helicopter tracked it from above. Soldiers from the defense forces stood on the perimeter of the criminal courts of justice on Parkgate Street when the cars arrived. That night, in a courtroom with 3 judges and no jury, Daniel Kinahan was charged with directing the activities of a criminal organization. He has not been tried. No court has found him guilty of anything. The charge against him is an allegation made by the Director of Public Prosecutions, and it will be tested in front of the Special Criminal Court, most likely in 2027. Under Irish law, he is presumed innocent, and that presumption is not a formality. It is the reason this film is careful about the difference between what a court has decided and what the state says it can prove. What is not in dispute is how much work it took to put him on that aircraft. This is a story about 16 years of police failure and police persistence. It runs from a housing estate in Dublin to a marina in Marbella, from a hotel car park on the Swords Road to a container ship boarded at sea off the coast of County Cork. It involves a collapsed prosecution in Spain, a sanctions notice issued in Washington, an extradition treaty signed in Abu Dhabi, and a series of encrypted phone networks that the people using them believed were unbreakable. It also involves professional boxing, which is how most people outside Ireland first heard the name. The arrest matters for a specific reason. For most of the last decade, the working assumption among European law enforcement was that certain people had placed themselves beyond reach. They lived in a jurisdiction with no extradition arrangement. They held property through companies, and they did not touch the product. The events of 2025 and 2026 tested that assumption. This is the story of how. Start with the aircraft, because the flight itself was the end of a long argument. Daniel Kinahan was detained in Dubai on the 15th of April 2026. The arrest was made by Dubai police working with the Ministry of Interior of the United Arab Emirates, on foot of a warrant issued by the Irish courts. He had been living in the city for roughly 10 years, openly, with his wife and children. He was not in hiding. He had a residence visa, a business address, and for several years a public profile in a legitimate sport. He fought the extradition through the Dubai courts for 3 months. In late July 2026, he lost his final appeal, a ruling confirmed at the level of the Court of Cassation, which is the highest court in the Emirate. That decision exhausted the process. Once it was made, the transfer was a matter of logistics. The aircraft was a Dassault Falcon jet operated by the Irish Air Corps. It left Al Maktoum International Airport at about 10:30 in the morning, Irish time, on the 9th of August. Irish detectives were on board for the return leg. The flight took most of the day. The jet landed at Baldonnel shortly after 6:30 in the evening, and the arrest followed 19 minutes later. The charge was put to him that night. It alleges that between the 18th of October 2015 and the 6th of April 2017, Daniel Kinahan directed the activities of a criminal organization. The offense sits in Section 71 of the Criminal Justice Act of 2006, as amended by the Criminal Justice Amendment Act of 2009. It carries a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. It is a charge about command, not about handling drugs. The prosecution case, as it has been described in court, is that he occupied the role of director of operations. The dates in that charge are not arbitrary. The window opens a few weeks after a shooting in Spain in September 2015 and closes in the spring of 2017. That period covers the worst of a feud between 2 Dublin criminal groups, and the investigation that grew out of it. Everything the prosecution intends to rely on as things stand sits inside those 18 months. 3 judges sat on the bench that night. Judge Fiona Liddon, Mr. Justice Patrick McGrath, and Judge Sarah Berkeley. Kinahan had no lawyer with him. He told the court that a family member would arrange a solicitor. He said he had been held in isolation since the previous Friday. When bail was explained to him, he told the judge that he thought they both already knew he would not be getting it, and thanked her for the explanation. He was remanded in custody to Portlaoise Prison, the maximum security facility in County Leys, and told to appear again on the 5th of October 2026. The Garda Commissioner, Justin Kelly, issued a short statement afterwards. It did not name Daniel Kinahan. It said the arrest showed the determination of the force, working with international policing partners including Dubai police, to target transnational organized crime groups. That restraint is itself a legal choice. In Ireland, once a person is before the courts, the state stops commenting on the merits. There is one more thing about the flight that matters. Daniel Kinahan was the first person ever extradited from the United Arab Emirates to Ireland under the permanent treaty between the two countries. That treaty was signed in Abu Dhabi in October 2024 and came into operation in Ireland in May 2025. Until it existed, there was no mechanism. The argument that a person in Dubai could not be brought back was, for years, simply true. To understand why that treaty was negotiated at all, you have to go back more than 30 years to a much smaller operation in Dublin. The organization is named after Christopher Kinahan Sr., who is Daniel Kinahan's father. He is a Dublin man, now in his late 60s, and his criminal record is a matter of public record because the United States government published a summary of it. According to the U.S. Treasury, he has served prison sentences in Ireland, in the Netherlands, and in Belgium. 6 years for dealing heroin, 2.5 years for possession of cocaine, 4 years for money laundering. He is often described in Irish reporting by a nickname he acquired for his manner and his clothes, the Dapper Don. He was, by the accounts of the officers who dealt with him, unusually literate for his trade, a man who studied languages in prison and read business books. What separated him from the Dublin criminals of his generation was not violence. It was structure. He treated importation as a supply chain problem. Through the 1990s, he built a drugs network in Dublin. Heroin first, then cocaine and cannabis in bulk. The Irish market was small, but it sat on a shipping route, and it used the same currency and the same banks as the rest of Europe. By the end of the decade, the model was no longer about selling on a street. It was about controlling the container before it reached one. Then he moved. The base of the operation shifted to the Costa del Sol in southern Spain, to the stretch of coast that runs through Marbella, Estepona, Fuengirola, and Mijas. On paper, this was a retirement coast, full of apartment blocks and marinas and northern European money. In practice, it was the closest thing in Europe to a wholesale market. Moroccan hashish came up through the Strait of Gibraltar. Colombian cocaine came into the Spanish ports. Everyone who mattered in the trade had a villa within an hour of the same harbor. Spain also offered something more practical. Property could be bought through companies. Bank accounts could be opened by nominees. A man who was known to the police in Dublin was, for a time, just another buyer in a market that did not ask hard questions about cash. By the beginning of the 2010s, according to police in 3 countries, the 2 sons had moved into senior positions. Daniel Kinahan, born in Dublin in June 1977, and his younger brother Christopher Jr. Neither has ever been convicted of a drugs offense in any jurisdiction. That is a fact worth stating early, because a great deal of what follows consists of allegations by states, and states have repeatedly failed to convert those allegations into convictions. The first serious attempt was made in May 2010, and it is the single most important failure in this story. It was called Operation Shovel. Spanish police, working with Irish and British agencies, moved on the Costa del Sol and arrested around 31 people. Villas were raided. Documents were seized. All 3 Kinahans were arrested. In Ireland, the operation was reported as the end of the organization. Photographs of the raids ran on the front pages. The assumption was that a prosecution of the leadership would follow within a year or two. It did not. In 2014, a Spanish judge dropped the drugs and weapons charges for insufficient evidence. The money laundering and criminal organization charges were left in place but never brought to trial, and in 2020 they were effectively mothballed. Of the 31 people arrested in 2010, 5 eventually faced trial, and on lesser charges than those originally contemplated. The prosecutor responsible for the Marbella area, Julio Martinez Carrazzo, spoke publicly about it in October 2020 and used the word disappointment. Against Christy Kinahan Sr., what survived was documentary. He was accused of using a false British passport in the name Michael Leslie Swift at Madrid Barajas Airport in April 2010, and a second forged document was found at a property in Benahavis. Passport fraud, at the end of a 10-year investigation into an alleged international trafficking network. There are competing explanations for the collapse, and it is worth being honest that no single one is proven. Spanish investigating magistrates work under time limits, and complex organized crime cases have repeatedly run into them. Evidence gathered in one country does not always transfer cleanly into another country's rules. Surveillance product that is admissible in Dublin may not be admissible in Madrid, and a case built on the movement of money is slow, expensive, and hard to explain to a court. What is not in dispute is the effect. Operation Shovel taught everyone involved a lesson, and the lesson was not the one the police intended. It demonstrated that a large multinational raid, with headlines and helicopters, could produce almost nothing at the end, and it demonstrated to the people who had been arrested that they had survived the best effort of 3 countries at once. It is worth stopping here to explain what the business being investigated actually consists of, because the popular picture of it is wrong in a way that matters. The cocaine that reaches Europe does not arrive in the boot of a car or in a suitcase. It arrives in shipping containers, in commercial quantities, through a small number of very large ports. Antwerp in Belgium and Rotterdam in the Netherlands handle the majority of it. Both are enormous. Both process millions of containers a year, and both can physically inspect only a tiny fraction of what passes through. The standard method, as described repeatedly in European court cases and in Europol assessments, does not require the shipping company to be involved at all. A consignment is placed inside a legitimate container of legitimate cargo, usually fruit, timber, scrap metal, or machinery, at a port in South America. The container's identifying number and its seal number are passed to a team at the destination. That team's job is to reach the container inside the terminal, take the cocaine out, and get it through the gate before the container is collected by the customer who ordered the bananas. Everything depends on people inside the port. A crane operator who can place a container where it can be reached. A worker with an access card. Someone in the terminal system who can look up where a box has been stacked. These are the people who are actually prosecuted, in Belgium and the Netherlands, in very large numbers, and they are often young men from the surrounding city recruited for a single job. The organization that arranges all of this may never see the product. Its function is coordination. It knows a supplier in one continent and a buyer in another. It can finance a shipment. It can supply the corrupted access at the port, and it can guarantee delivery. For that it takes a percentage. Europol has described networks of this kind as service providers rather than gangs, because what they sell is logistics and reliability rather than drugs. This is the model that Irish and European investigators have alleged the Kinahan organization operated within. It explains a great deal about why prosecutions are so difficult. A person who arranges a shipment by telephone from one country, involving a cargo that leaves a second country and arrives in a third, to be collected by people he has never met and sold on by a customer he has no interest in, has committed a serious offense in several jurisdictions, and has left almost no physical trace in any of them. It also explains the violence. In a market with no contracts and no courts, debt is enforced physically. A container lost to customs still has to be paid for by someone. Most of the killing that goes with the cocaine trade in Europe is not about territory. It is about who bears the loss when a shipment does not arrive. And it explains the money problem, which is the real constraint on the business. A successful importation produces cash in bulk in the wrong country. Getting a warehouse full of banknotes converted into something that can be spent is harder than importing the drugs in the first place. It requires cash-intensive businesses, property purchases, currency exchange, trade-based invoicing, and people willing to move money through bank accounts that will bear inspection. That is where the sanctions instrument eventually did its damage, and it is where the Criminal Assets Bureau in Dublin had already been working for years. Both were attacks on the same weak point. After Spain, the center of gravity moved again, this time much further from Europe. Dubai in the middle of the 2010s was becoming a residence of choice for a certain kind of internationally mobile businessman. It had direct flights to everywhere. It had a property market that welcomed cash. It had free zone company structures that were quick to set up and difficult to see through. And it had no extradition treaty with Ireland, which meant that an Irish arrest warrant landed there as a piece of paper with no legal force. There was more to it than the absence of a treaty. Dubai sits between Europe, Africa, and Asia, which makes it a natural place to coordinate anything that moves between them. It has one of the busiest airports in the world and a container port that handles cargo from every continent. Its banking sector had, for years, a reputation for discretion, and its gold and commodity markets provided routes for value to move without touching a conventional bank transfer. The city also had a large, settled population of British and Irish expatriates, which meant that a Dublin accent in a marina restaurant attracted no attention at all. A man could take his children to school, go to the gym, meet people for coffee in a hotel lobby and be entirely unremarkable. None of this is a criticism unique to the Emirates. Every jurisdiction that has built an economy on the free movement of money has faced the same problem, and several European countries dealt with it considerably later than they should have. But for a decade, the practical position was that a person wanted in Dublin could live openly in Dubai, and Irish detectives could do nothing about it beyond watching. That business was boxing, and it is the reason his name became known far outside Ireland. In 2012, he co-founded a boxing management company with Matthew Macklin, a former world middleweight title challenger from Birmingham. It began as MGM, the Macklin Gym Marbella, based on the Spanish coast. The move was not secret. It was, if anything, the opposite. Daniel Kinahan lived a visible life in Dubai. He was photographed. He gave a small number of interviews. He built a business in a sport that generates constant publicity by design. It later became MTK Global. Kinahan has said publicly that he stepped back from the company in 2017. At its peak, the company said it represented more than 100 professional fighters. The list of names is what made it significant. Tyson Fury, Carl Frampton, Billy Joe Saunders, Michael Conlan, Katie Taylor. These were not marginal figures. They were world champions and Olympic medalists, and several of them were among the biggest ticket sellers in the sport. Boxing has almost no central authority. There are 4 major sanctioning bodies, dozens of commissions, and no single licensing regime that operates across borders. A manager who can deliver fighters and finance fights can become important very quickly, and can do so without ever holding a position that requires a background check. The economics of the sport make this easier than it should be. A boxer is a small business with a short career and enormous costs. Training camps, coaching staff, medical care, sparring partners, travel and accommodation all have to be paid for months before any purse arrives. Someone has to carry that money. Whoever carries it acquires influence over which fights happen, in which country, and on whose broadcast contract. The company grew quickly. It signed young fighters early, built its own gyms, ran its own promotional events, and eventually secured broadcast arrangements in Britain and the United States. From the outside, it looked like a modernizing force in a sport that badly needed one, and many of the people who worked with it had no reason to look further than the contracts in front of them. In 2020, Tyson Fury named Kinahan on camera as the man who had brokered a proposed fight with Anthony Joshua. It was a short, casual video message thanking him for getting the deal done. That clip did more to internationalize the story than a decade of Irish crime reporting, because it moved the name out of the crime pages and into the sports pages of every country where boxing is broadcast. The response in Britain was a political row. Members of Parliament raised the matter in the House of Commons. Questions were asked about who was licensing events and who was checking the source of the money behind them. The British Boxing Board of Control said it had no jurisdiction over a manager operating outside its licensing system, which was accurate and which was also the entire problem. The reaction in Ireland was immediate, because in Ireland the name carried a different weight. By 2020, the country had spent 4 years living with the consequences of a shooting in a hotel on the Swords Road. The feud that defined the next decade of Irish policing began in Spain. On the 24th of September 2015, Gary Hutch, aged 34, was shot dead at an apartment complex near Marbella. He was a Dublin man and a nephew of Gerard Hutch, a figure from the north inner city of Dublin, whose own criminal history dated to the 1980s. Gary Hutch had been living and working in Spain within the same circle as the Kinahan Organization. The killing was, in the assessment of Irish police, the moment two families that had previously done business became enemies. In 2018, a Spanish court convicted a man named James Quinn of that murder and sentenced him to 22 years. During that trial, a police investigator gave evidence that the killing had been ordered by Daniel Kinahan. That was testimony from an investigator about his belief. It was not a finding against Kinahan, who was not a defendant in that trial and has never been charged in relation to Gary Hutch's death. What happened next took place in a hotel car park in Dublin on a Friday afternoon in winter. On the 5th of February 2016, a boxing weigh-in was being held at the Regency Hotel on the Swords Road in Whitehall, on the north side of Dublin. It was a public event. Fighters, families, promoters, and press were in the function room. Cameras were set up. The fights were scheduled for the following night. A 6-man team entered the hotel. Some of them wore tactical clothing designed to look like the uniform of the Garda Emergency Response Unit, complete with vests and caps. One was dressed as a woman. They carried 3 assault rifles of the AK-47 type and handguns. The attack lasted a matter of minutes. David Byan, aged 33, from Crumlin in Dublin, was shot dead in the hotel. He was associated with the Kinahan Organization. 2 other men were injured. The footage of armed men moving through a hotel lobby in a European capital, in daylight, in front of a room full of civilians, was broadcast around the world within hours. Gardaí believe that Daniel Kinahan was the intended target of the attack and that he was in the building when it began. He was not injured. He has never been charged with any offense arising from that day, and no court has made any finding about his presence or his conduct. Something changed in Ireland after the Regency. Organized crime in Dublin had produced murders before, regularly and for decades. What it had not produced was an attack that used the appearance of a police uniform as a disguise, in a public building, with military rifles. The state took that as a direct challenge, and the response was disproportionate in the literal sense. It was much larger than anything that had gone before. Armed patrols appeared on the streets of the North Inner City. The Garda Special Crime Task Force was expanded. A new structure, the Garda National Drugs and Organized Crime Bureau, took the lead on the investigation, and it was resourced in a way Irish police units were not usually resourced. Surveillance operations ran continuously. Officers were assigned to individual targets for months at a time. The scale of it was unusual for a country of 5 million people. Uniformed officers with automatic weapons stood outside courthouses and at funerals. Checkpoints went up on the routes into the North Inner City. The overtime bill ran into tens of millions of euro, and the figure was published annually and debated in the Dáil, because a police budget is a public document, and this one had a line on it that nobody had planned for. The area that absorbed most of this is roughly 1 square mile of Dublin between the river and the canal. It contains the Docklands, some of the most expensive office space in the country, and some of the most persistent poverty. The two exist within a few hundred meters of each other. Residents who had no connection to any of it lived for 3 years with armed patrols on their streets, with helicopters overhead, and with the knowledge that a shooting could happen outside a shop or a school. 2 government task forces were established to look at the North Inner City, and a substantial funding package was announced for community projects, youth services, and drug treatment. The people who had been arguing for that funding for 20 years pointed out, with some justification, that it took a series of murders to produce it. Funerals became a policing operation in themselves. Armed officers stood at the gates of churches. Mourners were photographed. Both of these things were legally justified, and both of them were experienced by families as an additional injury, and the tension between those two facts was never really resolved. There was also a legal consequence that outlasted the feud. The use of the Special Criminal Court, the 3-judge court without a jury, expanded significantly during this period. That court exists because the state can certify that an ordinary jury would be at risk of intimidation. Its use has been criticized for decades by civil liberties organizations and by United Nations committees, on the basis that a permanent emergency court is a contradiction in terms. It is also the court in which almost every significant prosecution in this story has been heard, including the one now pending. The killing did not stop. Over the following 3 years, a series of murders were attributed by Gardaí to the feud between the two groups. The United States Treasury, in a public document issued in 2022, described a gang war beginning in February 2016 that resulted in numerous murders, including of 2 innocent bystanders. The reward announcement issued alongside it referred to 18 murders over 3 years. That figure should be handled carefully. Different official and journalistic sources have used numbers ranging from 16 to 20, depending on which deaths are counted and over what period. 18 is the number most often used by authorities. What is beyond argument is that a substantial number of people died, that several of them had no involvement in crime of any kind, and that the 2 most conspicuous victims were killed for reasons that had nothing to do with anything they had done. One of those killings has since been tested in court, and it is worth pausing on because it is the clearest picture available of how the organization is alleged to have operated. In December 2016, Noel Kerwin, a 62-year-old man with no criminal record, was shot dead outside his home in Dublin. He was a friend of Gerard Hutch. He had been photographed with him at a funeral. That, according to the prosecution case that eventually followed, was the entire reason he was targeted. The man convicted of directing that murder is Sean McGovern, and his case is the closest thing that exists to a preview of the arguments the Special Criminal Court will hear about Daniel Kinahan. McGovern, aged 40, formerly of Kildare Road in Crumlin, was described in court by Mr. Justice Patrick McGrath as a senior trusted lieutenant of the organization in Ireland. He was one of the 7 individuals sanctioned by the United States in 2022. He had been living in Dubai. He was arrested there in October 2024 on an Interpol red notice. His return to Ireland in May 2025 was the first crack in the wall. There was still no treaty at that point, so it was done through a special one-off arrangement between the two governments, negotiated at ministerial level. He was flown back on the 29th of May 2025 and brought before the Special Criminal Court. In March 2026, he pleaded guilty. On the 8th of June 2026, he was sentenced to 24 years in prison, 14 years for directing the murder of Noel Kerwin, and 10 years for directing a plot to murder another man, James Gately, who survived. The 2 sentences run consecutively, backdated to his arrest in Dubai. The judge described the organization involved as particularly large, well-organized, sinister, and dangerous. McGovern is being held under an enhanced regime in Portlaoise and is expected to serve at least 16 years. He is, so far, the only one of the 7 sanctioned individuals to have been arrested, extradited, and convicted. The other line of attack ran through the Regency itself, and it produced a much more complicated result. The investigation into the hotel attack lasted years and was interrupted by tragedy. Detective Superintendent Colm Fox, the senior investigating officer, died in February 2018. His death led directly to the collapse of one prosecution. In 2019, the charge against Patrick Hutch Jr. was withdrawn by the state, a decision recorded as a nolle prosequi, because of evidential difficulties that followed the loss of the officer who had assembled the case. The trial that did proceed opened in Dublin and ran for 52 days. The defendants included Gerard Hutch, charged with the murder of David Byron, and 2 other men charged with facilitating it. There was no jury. The Special Criminal Court, established under the Offences Against the State Act, sits with 3 judges in cases where the state certifies that a jury would be at risk of intimidation. The prosecution's central witness was Jonathan Dowdall, a former Sinn Féin councillor from Dublin who had pleaded guilty in 2022 to facilitating the murder by booking a hotel room. He received a 4-year sentence and entered witness protection. Much of the case depended on recordings of conversations between Dowdall and Hutch, captured by a listening device placed in a car during a journey to Northern Ireland. The verdicts were delivered on the 17th of April 2023 by MS Justice Tara Burns, sitting with Judge Sarah Berkeley and Judge Grain Malone. Gerard Hutch was acquitted of the murder of David Byron. The court held that the prosecution had failed to prove its case to the criminal standard. In the same judgment, the court found that Hutch had control of the assault rifles used in the attack at least by the 7th of March 2016, a month after it happened. Paul Murphy and Jason Bonney were convicted of facilitating the murder. Each had supplied a vehicle used by the attackers. Murphy provided a Toyota Avensis taxi. Bonney provided a black BMW. On the 12th of May 2023, they were sentenced to 9 years and 8.5 years respectively. Those sentences were upheld on appeal in July 2026. Gerard Hutch was later refused his legal costs, estimated at more than €500,000, and remained under investigation by Gardaí in relation to other matters. He is not a defendant in the case now before the courts, and no finding of guilt has ever been made against him in relation to the Regency. The Dowdall evidence raises a question that runs through every case in this story, which is what it costs to obtain testimony from inside a criminal organization. A person who gives evidence in a case of this kind cannot go home afterwards. The Irish Witness Protection Program, run by An Garda Síochána, involves relocation, a change of identity, and the permanent loss of contact with extended family. It is expensive, it is administratively difficult, and the number of people in it at any time is not published for obvious reasons. It also creates a permanent problem for prosecutors. A witness who has received a reduced sentence and a new life in exchange for testimony is, by definition, a witness with an interest in the outcome. Defense counsel will say so at length, and courts are required to treat such evidence with caution. In the Regency trial, the court accepted parts of Jonathan Dowdall's account and did not accept others, which is exactly what the caution rule is designed to produce. That is why so much of the successful work in this story was documentary rather than testimonial. A property registration does not have a motive. A bank transfer cannot be cross-examined. A message recovered from a server in France says what it says regardless of who recovered it. That outcome is instructive. 7 years of investigation, one of the largest evidence-gathering exercises in the history of the state, and the man the prosecution said was at the center of it walked out of the building. It reinforced something the Spanish case had already suggested. Prosecuting the people who plan a crime, rather than the people who commit it, is extraordinarily difficult when the planning is done in conversation. Which is why the more effective line of attack, over the same period, was not about violence at all. It was about money, and it was conducted mostly by accountants. Ireland has an institution that most countries do not, and it was created in response to an earlier crisis. The Criminal Assets Bureau was established in 1996 after the murder of the journalist Veronica Guerin and the murder of Detective Garda Jerry McCabe. It brings together Gardaí, tax inspectors and social welfare officials in a single unit, and it operates in the civil courts rather than the criminal ones. That distinction is the whole point. The Bureau does not have to prove that a person committed a crime beyond reasonable doubt. It has to persuade a judge on the balance of probabilities that an asset is the proceeds of crime. If it succeeds, the asset is frozen and eventually forfeited to the state. There is no jury. There is no requirement to identify a particular offense. What the Bureau produces in court is not testimony about a shipment. It is a set of documents showing that a person who declared very little income owns a house worth a great deal. The Bureau spent years working through property connected to the organization. The clearest example is a house at Coldwater Lakes in Sagart, on the southwestern edge of Dublin. It had been Daniel Kinahan's home in Ireland. The Bureau's case connected it, through a chain of transactions, to a businessman named Jim Mansfield Jr. and to Thomas Kavanagh. The house was seized and sold at auction in December 2024 for €931,000, the highest price the Bureau had ever obtained at a sale. The Bureau also pursued a man it described in court as the organization's principal representative in Ireland, Ross Browning, in proceedings concerning more than €1.5 million in assets. In its annual report for 2025, the Bureau said it had returned just under €15 million to the Exchequer over the year. None of that reached the leadership directly. What it did was more corrosive. It made Ireland a jurisdiction where property could not be held safely, and it forced money outward into structures that were harder to control and easier to trace. In Britain, the same work produced convictions. Thomas Kavanagh from Tamworth in Staffordshire was described by the National Crime Agency as the organization's figurehead in the United Kingdom. In March 2022, at Ipswich Crown Court, he was sentenced to 21 years for conspiracy to import cocaine and cannabis and for money laundering. Gary Vickery received 20 years and Daniel Kinahan 19.5. The agency estimated that the group had imported drugs worth more than £30 million. The evidence in that case was physical and unglamorous. In 2017, officers at Dover intercepted a consignment hidden inside tarmac removal machinery. 15 kilograms of cocaine and more than 200 kilograms of cannabis were concealed in the equipment. The importation was disguised as a road maintenance business, with invoices, a haulage arrangement, and a warehouse at the far end. Kavanagh's story acquired an additional chapter in 2024. He was given a further 6-year sentence to run concurrently, over a scheme in which he arranged for a cache of firearms to be planted so that he could then direct police to it and appear to be cooperating in the hope of reducing his sentence. The plan was exposed by messages recovered from an encrypted phone network. In July 2025, confiscation orders were made against him for just over £1.1 million and against Vickery for around £109,000. Those encrypted networks deserve their own explanation because they changed European organized crime investigation more than any single arrest. For most of the 2010s, serious criminal groups across Europe communicated on bespoke handsets sold by specialist companies. The phones had the cameras and microphones removed, ran a hidden messaging application behind a dummy interface, and were sold with a subscription rather than a contract. The two largest were EncroChat and Sky ECC. Users believed the traffic was invisible to police. It was not. In 2020, French and Dutch investigators managed to place an implant on the EncroChat network and read messages in something close to real time before the operators noticed and shut the service down. In 2021, Belgian and Dutch authorities did something comparable with Sky ECC. Between them, the two operations delivered hundreds of millions of messages in which people discussed shipments, prices, debts, and violence in plain language, believing themselves unobservable. Messages recovered from EncroChat featured directly in the British cases connected to this organization. In one exchange used in court, a man operating under the handle Thai Live discussed sourcing pistols. Material recovered from Sky ECC fed into a wider European investigation into what Europol described as a super cartel, a set of cooperating networks operating across Britain, Morocco, Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, and Spain. Over 2 years, that broader effort was linked to the seizure of around 30 tons of cocaine at European ports. The significance is not simply that police read the messages. It is that the messages showed how the trade actually worked, not as a hierarchy with one man giving orders, but as a market of brokers, transport specialists, port workers, money movers, and enforcers, in which a coordinating group takes a percentage for arranging a shipment it never physically touches. That model is enormously profitable and enormously difficult to prosecute, because the person at the top can go years without ever being in the same country as a kilogram of anything, which is why, in the spring of 2022, the United States tried a completely different instrument. On the 11th of April 2022, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, a division of the United States Treasury, designated the Kinahan Organized Crime Group and 7 of its alleged members under an executive order aimed at transnational criminal organizations. The order in question, number 13581, was originally signed to target groups like the Italian Mafia, the Japanese Yakuza, and Mexican cartels. This was the first time it had been applied to an Irish organization. 3 men were named as leaders: Christopher Kinahan Sr., Daniel Kinahan, Christopher Kinahan Jr. 4 associates were named alongside them: Sean McGovern, Ian Dixon, Bernard Clancy, John Morrissey. 3 companies were designated as well: Dukashu General Trading, a Dubai company which the Treasury said was owned or controlled by Daniel Kinahan; Hupo Sports, another Dubai entity linked to Ian Dixon; and Nero Drinks Company, registered in the United Kingdom. A sanctions designation is not a criminal charge, and it does not require a court. What it does is remove a person from the financial system. Any assets within reach of United States jurisdiction are blocked. Any American person or company is prohibited from dealing with them. Critically, because the dollar clears through American banks, the practical effect extends far beyond America. A bank in any country that processes a payment for a designated person risks its own access to the dollar system. Compliance departments do not take that risk. The announcement was made in Dublin, at a press conference held jointly by American and Irish officials. The action had been coordinated with the Drug Enforcement Administration, the State Department, United States Customs and Border Protection, and Garda Síochána, the British National Crime Agency, and Europol. Alongside the designations, the State Department offered rewards of up to $5 million each for information leading to the arrest or conviction of the 3 men named as leaders. $15 million in total. The effect on the boxing business was immediate and total. Within days, promoters across the sport cut their connections. Bob Arum, the veteran American promoter who runs Top Rank, said publicly that he regretted having worked with Kinahan. Tyson Fury said he had left MTK in 2020 and had no ongoing involvement. On the 20th of April 2022, 9 days after the designation, MTK Global announced that it would cease operations entirely. That is what a sanctions designation does that a prosecution does not. It required no evidence to be tested and no witness to give testimony, and it destroyed a functioning international company in 9 days. It also demonstrated something about the boxing industry, which is that the sport had no mechanism of its own for asking who was financing it. The question was only answered when a foreign Treasury Department answered it. The United Arab Emirates responded as well. Assets connected to the group were frozen, and the organization was reported to have been barred from doing business in the country. The reported value of the frozen assets, around €200 million, comes from official statements and has not been independently verified. For 18 months after that, very little visibly happened. Then a bulk carrier appeared on the radar of the Irish Naval Service. In September 2023, a Panamanian-flagged vessel called the MV Matthew was tracked across the Atlantic. She was a bulk carrier of about 28,000 tons, a working cargo ship of no obvious interest, and she was being watched by a joint operation involving the Garda National Drugs and Organized Crime Bureau, the Revenue Customs Service, and the Defense Forces, with intelligence support from partner agencies abroad. A second, much smaller vessel was watched alongside her. A trawler named the Castlemore, bought in Britain a short time earlier, which had put to sea from the southeast coast of Ireland. The working assessment was that the trawler existed to take a cargo off the larger ship at sea and bring it ashore in small quantities. The weather ended that plan. The Castlemore lost her anchor and ran aground on a sandbank off the Wexford coast. Her 2 crew members were rescued by the Irish Coast Guard helicopter and arrested. The MV Matthew, now without a receiving vessel, began to move. What followed on the 26th of September 2023 was the first operation of its kind carried out by the Irish state. The naval vessel, the William Butler Yeats, closed on the ship in poor conditions in the Celtic Sea. The MV Matthew refused instructions to stop and altered course repeatedly. The naval vessel fired warning shots and deployed its deck-mounted machine gun. Soldiers of the Army Ranger Wing then fast-roped from a helicopter onto the deck of a moving cargo ship in heavy weather. The vessel was secured and brought into Cork Harbor under escort. On board, officers found 2,253 kilograms of cocaine, just over 2¼ tons, with an estimated street value of about €157 million. It was and remains the largest drug seizure in the history of the Irish state. Evidence given at the subsequent trial described attempts to destroy the cargo once the crew understood they had been detected. Messages were recovered in which instructions were given to burn the load and to head for West Africa. Some of the cocaine was set on fire on the deck. The fire was not effective enough to matter. 8 men from 5 countries were sentenced at the Special Criminal Court on the 4th of July 2025. The total came to 129 years, with individual sentences ranging from 13½ years to 20 years. The longest term, 20 years, was imposed on a Dutch national named Kumali Ozgen, who the court found had been placed on board to represent the interests of the organizers. Here the language has to be exact, because this is the point at which reporting and court findings diverge. The Kinahan organization was not named in that trial. Detective Superintendent Keith Halley told the court that the operation had been run by a transnational organized crime group based in Dubai, with immense capabilities, unlimited resources, and global reach, operating through a cell structure in which participants knew only their own part. He did not name the group. The presiding judge, MS Justice Melanie Greeley, described the crew as valuable components of the engine that drives international drug smuggling, and treated the involvement of an organized crime group as an aggravating factor. She did not name it either. The attribution to the Kinahan organization was made outside the courtroom. Detective Chief Superintendent Seamus Boland, the head of the Garda National Drugs and Organized Crime Bureau, said in a documentary broadcast in 2025 that from their investigations they were satisfied the Kinahan Organized Crime Group was involved in the importation. That is a senior officer's on-the-record assessment. It is not a judicial finding, and no defendant in the M.V. Matthew case was linked in court by name to the organization. Claims that have circulated about the financing of that shipment by armed groups in the Middle East come from journalists citing unnamed sources and have not been tested anywhere. They should be treated accordingly. There is one further point that matters for accuracy. The charge now before the Special Criminal Court against Daniel Kinahan does not relate to the M.V. Matthew. The dates in that charge end in April 2017, more than 6 years before the ship was boarded. What the seizure did change was political. 2.25 tons of cocaine arriving on the Irish coast, in a vessel that had to be taken by soldiers, made the question of where the organizers were living into a diplomatic problem rather than a police one. That question had a specific answer, and the answer was a city with which Ireland had no legal relationship. Negotiations with the United Arab Emirates ran through 2024 at ministerial level. Irish officials traveled to Abu Dhabi. On the 21st of October 2024, an extradition treaty between the two states was signed. In Ireland, it required a statutory instrument to bring it into effect, the Extradition United Arab Emirates Order, which came into operation on the 18th of May 2025. The change in the Emirates was not really about Ireland. Over the same period, the country came under sustained pressure over its role in international financial flows, including a period on the gray list of the Financial Action Task Force, the international body that assesses money laundering controls. Removal from that list required demonstrable action. Extradition treaties, asset freezes, and cooperation on organized crime were part of what demonstrable action looked like. Sean McGovern went first, in May 2025, under a one-off arrangement while the treaty was still being brought into force. Daniel Kinahan followed 11 months later. His arrest, on the 15th of April 2026, was made by Dubai police in cooperation with the Ministry of Interior. He contested the extradition through every available stage, arguing at each level against his surrender. The final ruling went against him in late July. 3 months and 3 weeks after his detention, he was on an Irish military aircraft over the Gulf, which brings this back to a courtroom on Parkgate Street on a Sunday night in August 2026, and to the position as it stands today. Daniel Kinahan is remanded in custody in Portlaoise Prison. He is charged with one offence, directing the activities of a criminal organization between October 2015 and April 2017. He has not entered a plea. He is due before the Special Criminal Court again on the 5th of October 2026, at which stage the Book of Evidence, the document setting out the prosecution case, is expected to be served on him. A trial is not anticipated before 2027, and cases of this kind frequently take longer. He is presumed innocent of that charge, and will remain so unless and until a court decides otherwise. Nothing in this account should be read as suggesting a conclusion that only 3 judges in Dublin are entitled to reach. His father and his brother are not in custody. Christopher Kinahan Sr., now 69, and Christopher Kinahan Jr., 45, remain in Dubai. Both were sanctioned by the United States in 2022, and both remain, as of August 2026, uncharged with any offence in Ireland. Reporting published in 2026 by open-source investigators, working with a British newspaper, indicated that both men had continued to deal with immigration authorities and to be issued with visas despite the sanctions, and that they had been filmed at a sporting event in Dubai in June 2025. Neither has responded publicly. The American rewards of up to $5 million each remain in place for information leading to their arrest. The wanted notice for Daniel Kinahan was amended after his detention to record that he had been captured. No reward is payable on his arrest unless there is a conviction, and the American authorities have said the status of any payment will not be made public, in order to protect the people who provide information. Of the 7 individuals sanctioned in 2022, one has been convicted. Sean McGovern is serving 24 years. One is before the courts. The remaining 5 have not been charged in Ireland. That is a partial result, and it is worth saying so plainly rather than pretending otherwise. What has changed is structural rather than dramatic. The Criminal Assets Bureau model, which was itself created in response to a murder in 1996, has been copied in several European jurisdictions, because a civil standard of proof applied to property turns out to be more effective against organized crime than a criminal standard applied to people. The encrypted phone operations demonstrated that the assumption of secure communication was wrong, and the prosecutions that flowed from them are still working through the courts of half a dozen countries. Ireland now has an extradition treaty with the United Arab Emirates, and the treaty has been used. The precedent set by that first flight is more important than the individual it carried, because it removes the argument that a particular address places a person outside the reach of a warrant. Boxing has changed least. There was no formal reckoning, no inquiry, and no new licensing regime. The sport's response to the events of April 2022 was to sever the specific relationships that had become publicly untenable, and then to continue. The structural problem that allowed an unlicensed figure to become central to the sport's finances, which is that boxing has no unified authority capable of asking where money comes from, remains exactly as it was. The Regency Hotel was demolished. The site on the Swords Road was redeveloped, and the building that stood there in February 2016 no longer exists. The deaths are the part that does not resolve. Somewhere between 16 and 20 people were killed in a feud between 2 Dublin criminal groups over 3 years. Most of them were involved in that world in some fashion. 2 of them, by every official account, were not involved in anything at all. Noel Kerwin was 62 years old and was killed because of a photograph taken at a funeral. His killing is one of the 2 matters for which Sean McGovern was convicted and is serving 14 years. The people who investigated all of this spent 16 years on it. They watched a case collapse in Spain in 2014. They lost their senior investigating officer in 2018 and lost a prosecution with him. They watched the central defendant in the Regency trial acquitted in 2023 after 52 days of evidence. The work that eventually produced results was not the dramatic part. It was the property files, the company records, the sanction submissions, the treaty negotiation, and the recovered messages. On the 5th of October 2026, the Special Criminal Court will sit again. The book of evidence will be served. In due course, a trial will be listed, and 3 judges will decide whether the state can prove what it has alleged for more than a decade. Until then, the charge is a charge and nothing more.